What if there's a moment in your self-leadership journey when you stop thinking, I need to remember to pause and breathe, and you just naturally pause? When you stop trying to embody grace, you simply are graceful. When connected leadership moves from something that you practice to who you are. Over the past several episodes, we've built a comprehensive toolkit for leading yourself through every area of life. Today, in our series finale, I want to explore what integration looks like, how you know when these practices have become your natural way of being, and how to sustain transformation for lifelong growth and impact. In the last episode, we explored how to maintain your center during crisis, those storm testing moments when all your practices matter most. But what happens after the storm? How do you know if you've truly integrated these skills or if you're just better at applying techniques? The difference between conscious competence and unconscious mastery is where transformation becomes sustainable. I'm Dr. Cara. Here's what I've observed about lasting change. Most people cycle through periods of growth and regression because they haven't moved from practicing new behaviors to embodying new identity. They're still trying to be more self-aware rather than being self-aware. This creates what I call practice fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring yourself, the frustration when you forget to use your tools during challenging moments, and the fear that your growth isn't sustainable because it requires too much effort. You might find yourself thinking, I should know, pause before reacting, but in the moment, I just forgot. Or, I understand the framework intellectually, but when I'm activated, it all goes out the window. You could feel disappointed when old patterns resurface, interpreting this as failure rather than recognizing it as part of the integration process. Here's what distinguishes sustainable transformation from temporary improvement. Integrated self-leadership doesn't feel like work. It feels like coming home to yourself. When the practices become who you are rather than what you do, they're available even when you're not consciously thinking about them. Let me share a moment when I realized my self-leadership practice has shifted from something I was doing to something I had become. Several months ago, I was in the middle of a particularly challenging work situation. A project that I had been leading for months was falling apart due to circumstances completely outside of my control. Key stakeholders were frustrated, timelines were collapsing, and there was significant pressure to find someone to blame. I was driving home after a particularly difficult meeting when I noticed something unexpected. Instead of the familiar spiral out of stress, self-doubt, and mental problem solving that used to consume me after setbacks, I found myself naturally setting into a different state. Without consciously deciding to use my RPR method, I was already receiving the situation with clarity, acknowledging both the real challenges and the emotional reactions without getting lost in either. I was perceiving my own responses with curiosity rather than judgment, noticing my disappointment about the project while remaining connected to my inherent worth. And I was already considering how to respond from my values rather than reactive patterns. What struck me wasn't that I handled the situation well. I had been doing that more consistently for years. What was remarkable was the self-leadership response had become automatic. I wasn't trying to remember my practices. They were simply who I was in the moment. Later that evening, I had a conversation with my best friend about the work situation. She made an observation that crystallized what had shifted. You seem disappointed about the project, but not shaken by it. You're processing it, but you're not carrying it. That's when I realized integration had occurred. The 3 pillars of my framework for connected leadership weren't just tools I picked up when needed. They had become integral to how I moved through the world. Recognizing value had become so internalized that external setbacks didn't trigger questions about my fundamental worth. I was disappointed about the project outcome without making it mean something about my value as a professional, a leader, or a person. Embodying grace had evolved from a practice of self-compassion to a natural acceptance of both success and failure being part of growth. I wasn't berating myself for things outside of my control or pretending that the situation didn't matter. Conquering control transformed from conscious effort to redirect my focus to intuitive understanding of what I could and couldn't influence. I was naturally directing my energy towards useful responses rather than wasting it on unchangeable circumstances. This experience taught me to recognize the signs that connected self-leadership has moved from practice to identity. Unconscious competence. That pause happens automatically. You perceive multiple perspectives without forcing yourself to be open-minded. Your responses align with your values without conscious collaboration. You gain emotional resilience. Challenges still affect you, but they don't destabilize you. You feel disappointment without despair, frustration without fury, uncertainty without panic. Your emotional range remains full, but your recovery time accelerates and your baseline stability strengthens. You show up similarly across different contexts, not identically, but consistently aligned with your core self. Your work persona, family interactions, friendships all reflect the same fundamental values and presence. You gain natural boundaries. You set limits, not through forced assertiveness, but through natural alignment with your energy and values. Saying no sounds protective rather than aggressive. Saying yes feels generous rather than feeling obligated. You're curious rather than judgmental. When you notice old patterns or reactive moments, your first response is curiosity rather than self-criticism. You're interested in what activated the reaction and what it might teach you rather than judging yourself for being imperfect. You gain effortless influence. Others begin commenting on your presence, your calm during difficulty, or your ability to see situations clearly. You're not trying to influence them. Your integrated self-leadership naturally creates space for others to find their own center. Let me describe what integration looks like in a common scenario. Let's say a receiving criticism from someone important to you. The pre-integration response would be, you remember to pause and breathe, consciously work through your hurt feelings, deliberately consider their perspective, and carefully craft a response that doesn't escalate conflict. This takes significant mental energy and feels like you're managing yourself. Now, the integrated response would be you naturally receiving their words without immediately taking them personal. You find yourself genuinely curious about their perspective while staying connected to your own truth. Your response emerges from balanced consideration of both viewpoints without feeling forced or calculated. The difference isn't in the outcome. Both approaches might lead to similar resolutions. The difference is in the internal experience. Integration feels organic rather than effortful, sustainable rather than draining. When someone observes this integrated response, they don't think, wow, she's got really good at conflict management techniques. They think, she seems so centered and wise. I want to understand how she stays so calm and clear. Here's how to support your own integration process. The natural response inventory. This practice helps you recognize when self-leadership is becoming integrated rather than just practice. Each week, reflect on these questions. What challenging situation did I handle differently than I would a year ago? When did I notice myself naturally pausing instead of reacting? What old trigger held less power over me this week? Where did I feel authentic and aligned without conscious effort? Integration indicators allow you to watch for these signs that practices are becoming identity. You catch yourself naturally using RPR without deciding to. Others comment on your presence or responses. You feel curious rather than critical when old patterns resurface. Difficult situations feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Your energy level remains more stable during challenging periods. Let's talk about a sustainable practice design. This is where you create a long-term approach that supports continued growth. Maintain one simple daily practice that keeps you connected to your center. Schedule regular reflection time to process what you're learning. Stay connected to community or support that reinforces your growth. Remain open to new challenges that deepen your self-leadership. The goal isn't perfection, it's progressive integration that makes self-leadership your natural way of being. Integration brings a paradox. The more self-leadership becomes who you are rather than what you practice, the more you realize how much you still have to learn. This realization feels exciting rather than overwhelming because you trust your capacity to grow. You begin to see that self-leadership isn't a destination that you reach, but a way of traveling through life. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to deepen your practice rather than evidence that you haven't mastered it yet. A profound shift is that you stop seeing yourself as someone who has problems and start seeing yourself as someone who navigates challenges with wisdom and grace. Problems become puzzles to solve rather than evidence of inadequacy. This identity shift creates what I call generous shift. You become a resource for others, not because you have all the answers, but because you've learned to stay connected to yourself while facing uncertainty. Your presence becomes an invitation for others to find their own center. When connected self-leadership becomes integrated, you create influence of transformation that extends far beyond your individual experience. Your family members learn emotional regulation, not from your teaching, but from your modeling. Your colleagues experience psychological safety in your presence. Your friends feel permission to be authentic because you stop performing perfection. You become the one others seek out during their difficult moments, not because you give great advice, but because you create space for them to access their own wisdom. Your questions help them think more clearly rather than your answers solving their problems. Most importantly, you discover your most powerful impact comes not from what you achieve, but from who you are while you're achieving it. Your integrated self-leadership becomes a gift to everyone whose life intersects yours. You develop what I call sustainable influence, the ability to create positive change through your presence and choices rather than through force or manipulation. Your influence continues even when you're not consciously trying to lead anyone. As we conclude this journey together, I want you to recognize what you've built, a comprehensive framework for leading yourself through every area of life with wisdom, authenticity, and grace. You've learned to make conscious daily choices that align with your values. You've practiced staying human while parenting humans. You've developed skills to maintain your authentic self in partnerships, friendships, and professional environments. You've discovered how to remain centered even when life gets chaotic. Most importantly, you learned that the quality of your life isn't determined by your circumstances, but by how you meet your circumstances. You've developed the inner resources to handle whatever life presents while remaining true to who you are. The practices you've learned aren't just techniques. They're invitations to remember who you really are beneath all the roles, expectations, and external pressures. They're pathways back to your essential self. Your connected self-leadership journey doesn't end here. It's actually just beginning. You have the tools, the framework, and the understanding. Now comes the lifelong adventure of living from this place of integrated wisdom. I want to leave you with this truth. You already have everything that you need to lead yourself through any situation that life presents. You don't need to become someone different. You need to remember who you've always been beneath all the conditioning and fear. Trust yourself. Trust the process. Trust that every challenge is an opportunity to deepen your practice and expand your capacity for wisdom and love. Remember, when you lead yourself well, you give everyone around you permission to do the same. Your integrated self-leadership becomes a gift, not just to you, but to everyone whose life you touch. The world needs leaders who are connected to themselves, grounded in their values, and committed to their growth. The world needs you, not a perfect version of you, but the authentic, evolving, beautifully human you. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Now go lead yourself with the wisdom, grace, and courage that you've always possessed.